No, I knew that. I just didn't know. Jim Butcher. So, first of all, I'd like each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and say why they're on a panel about urban fantasy.
Some people here might think I'm bluffing because I'm meant to be Mr. Singularity guy. But I have a furtive, guilty pleasure side project, which is an entire urban fantasy series for Laundry Files, that some of you might have heard of. Book 6 is coming out on the 7th of July this year. And it's about superheroes. Because over to Mike.
I guess I'm here because I wrote Hellraiser for 3.5 years, and I wrote a series of fantasy novels or supernatural crime thrillers called Caster novels.
And I think if you want to get absolutely technical, I'm here because of Jim, who told me about 15 years ago that I should write an urban fantasy novel. And so I did. My longest running series is The Walker Papers, which is about a Samuel Conn who's a shaman. And I've been writing urban fantasy for about, well, publishing urban fantasy for about the last 10 years.
I'm the author of a series called The Dresden Files. And as far as I'm concerned, they're basically my dumb little wizard books that somehow trick people into thinking they're actual novels. So.
Okay, now there's been a lot of change in what is and isn't urban fantasy. So when I started reading urban fantasy, it was sort of Wizard of the Pigeons, and these days it's all sparkly vampires.
Not for much longer.
Lamb's fattened words.
So Charlie, tell us about urban fantasy and what it means to you.
Anecdote. January, I make a point of going to New York and doing lunch with my agent who lives out in my editors because it's a good way to keep yourself ahead. And over lunch, I was chatting with Susan Allison, the VP in charge of Ace and Rock at Penguin, Random Penguin, and she startled me somewhat by prognosticating about the future of the industry. She just fixed me with a steely glare and declared ex cathedra, urban fantasy is dead. but Susan, you're about to publish another laundry novel. That's urban fantasy, isn't it? No, it isn't. Huh? What's urban fantasy then? Well, you got this hot chick with a sword and a tattoo on the small of her back and a hot werewolf or vampire boyfriend, or maybe one of each, she's trying to decide between the two. That's urban fantasy. And you can get away with it if you're Patricia Briggs or Laurel K. Hamilton, but if you're just starting out, go somewhere else. We don't want it. And that's from the head of Ace and Rock. And there is an awful lot of that stuff, what you might call the commodity second generation, strong female protagonist with a thing for furries. There's a surplus of it that's sloshing around the marketplace right now.
For what it's worth. I sold Urban Shaman first to my urban fantasy series in 2004, or late 2003. And at the time, every editor in New York that I could get anywhere near, that I could hear anything from who was talking, said urban fantasy was dead. So urban fantasy has had an extremely long death now here.
Death rows lasting for a decade.
Yes, that's better than Desdemona in Othello, and which is I thought the most drawn out death scene ever. So.
I think she was actually mislabeling it. What she should have said was paranormal romances oversold. Urban fantasy, I think what we're here to discuss is fantasy set in a modern urban setting. If it's set in an old-fashioned urban setting, we call it Discworld or maybe steampunk.
I've never read a paranormal romance willingly. My two reference points for urban fantasy, I think, are still The Sandman and Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Jim?
Fully dated.
What's your reference for urban fantasy?
Well, I'm just thinking that Buffy had at least the vampire boy. She never really got into werewolves, though, so I guess she doesn't qualify, yeah. I think my take on urban fantasy has always been that urban fantasy, at least as a lot of people are writing it, is just Grimm's fairy tales updated. Grimm's fairy tales were by and large set in the forest because most people had to deal with the forest, and that was something that was continually, ongoingly creepy place where bad things could happen to you and nobody would know it. These days we don't really have a forest, but almost everybody has got to deal with a city, which is a creepy place where bad things could happen to you and nobody would know it. And I think that a lot of what we're doing is we're just taking the same old storytelling where we're going to say, look, here's a creepy setting, and there's weird things there, and weird bad things could happen to you, and let me tell you a story about it. And that's what we're doing, and we're just doing what's been done for many centuries, and we just happen to be, the most recent caretakers of that particular fire. Katie.
Now, I was reading Urban Fame quite recently, and this is strong female protagonist with, as I recall, at least 2 swords on different occasions.
Yes, in fact.
So, what's your take on the way the genre is going?
I think that, well, first I want to very quickly address paranormal romance versus urban fantasy. In my view, urban fantasy focuses a little more on the world building and the development of the world in which our heroes and bad guys live, the magic of it. And paranormal romance tends to be a little more focused on the relationship between the hero and the heroine. And so that tends to be my definition more than actually the two swords and tramp stamp. But I think that I think it's getting harder to sell urban fantasy. I do think that is true. But I'm not sure it's because readers are tired of it. I think the same thing as 10 years ago. I think that editors have to read a lot of bad stuff. They get a lot of the stuff that's just not good. And when you read a lot of bad stuff, you don't want to read any more of it. You get tired of that genre, whether or not there's still good stuff coming out of it. And so I think that they are becoming increasingly resistant to buying urban fantasy, but I'm not sure it's because the readers are tired of it. But we live in a strange new world now of self-publishing as well, so especially for people with established audiences, if you have urban fantasy stories to tell, you have an audience to reach. So.
I was thinking, one of the things you get in all the genres is they age, they get tired, as Katie said. Editors stop wanting to read the same stuff, but they also reinvent themselves, and you get new micro-genres forming in strange places, mutating like bubbles in a drink. One of the ones that's coming out of urban fantasy now, in the past couple of years, is what you might call police procedural urban fantasy. Now, the Harry Dresden books are very obviously private eye riffs, but I'm thinking specifically of Paul Cornell's London Falling and the Seven Streets, and of Ben Aronovich's Peter Grant books, which have all been runaway successes, and which are very much the London Metropolitan Police meet magic.
I also can't help wondering if a little bit of that is the fact that they are London-based, and so much urban fantasy is American-based, and so we've literally got a new landscape with those books, which is, I think, another appealing aspect.
London is a very weird city.
And, Katie, your heroine,
Joanne.
Joanne Walker,
Yes, Joanne Walker.
is a policeman.
Yes.
At least she's in the first book.
Yes.
So, do you see urban fantasy as having come out of the hard-boiled detective film noir genre? I mean, it certainly seems Mike and Jim's works, it's very much hard-boiled detective in a fantasy setting. Is that where you see it's coming from? So, what next?
What next? If I knew what next, I'd be doing it. honestly, if any of us had the ability to predict the curve, we the strong influences of the Dresden Files was an HBO movie that came out many, many moons ago when they were first doing HBO movies called Cast a Deadly Spell. Yeah, you remember that one? Yeah. Yeah, the guy that gets slashed to ribbons by dollar bills was in a magical windstorm. It was kind of awesome. But anyway, that was a strong influence for me, and then it was obvious that the PI influence is obvious from the Dresden Files, although I think probably Robert Parker's work influenced me more strongly than anything else. But, as far as where it's going next, I don't know. I guess the PI shows segued into the procedural shows on television, at least. Maybe we're seeing an echo of that now.
What you said, Jim, about Grimm's fairy tales, going down to wild woods and switching to the city street, it occurs to me Private Eye is very much a woodsman of the urban landscape.
One of my formative influences was reading Roger Lasney's Nine Princes in Ember, and then discovering Raymond Chandler off the back of it. So I encountered noir, first of all, as a sci-fi fantasy fusion. It came as no surprise to me that noir was a style that could be in any genre. I think there's that is definitely one of the motive engines in that mashup.
Well, and any book needs a plot, and urban fantasies very, very frequently rely on mysteries as the plots. Again, paranormal romance it's more focused on the romance of the story. And so when you're coming out of that, if you're coming out of looking at a story as your trappings are magical, but your backbone is a mystery, whodunit, somebody is dead at the beginning, you have to find out by the end who's done it. You're going to have that noir element, and that was certainly part of what influenced me, was knowing that I like reading and writing mysteries, and so that was part of what I wanted to incorporate into the Walker Papers, was that element of storytelling. I wanted investigations for this character. I wanted her to find out both whodunit and about the world that she had been thrust into.
Can I come back to the question of what's next? I think one of the things that's next, when you said, Jim, about fantasy being based the modern version of Grimm's fairy tales, I've just finished reading Frances Harding's Cuckoo Song, which reads very much like straight folklore, but set in 1920s Britain, not in London, in sort of wilds of Oxfordshire.
So Jim, the Dresden Files, you approach that in the same way that Davies approached Walker Papers? Were you trying to find out about the character?
I approached the Dresden Files as a means to prove to my writing professor how wrong she was about trying to teach me about writing. At the time, I was 25, and I knew everything about writing when I was 25, much more than I know now. She'd been trying to give me very good advice for a very long time, and I was ignoring her because I knew what I wanted to do and what I wanted to write, and how it should be done, and I did, after all, have a bachelor's degree in English literature with an emphasis in creative writing, whereas she had merely published 40 novels. So I decided, after she gave me good advice for a while, I decided one semester that I was going to prove to her how wrong she was. And my means of doing so was ingenious in its simplicity. I was just going to do everything that she said. I was going to fill out all the little worksheets, all the little outlines. I was going to even change the genre of work I was working in to what she had suggested. And I was going to do all of that and do her little wooden character creation process. And that would show her what terrible cookie-cutter pablum crap emerged from that kind of process. And I wrote the first book of the Dresden Files. Which clearly showed her.
So somebody learned a lesson.
Yes, I've been much...
Clearly his teacher.
I've been increasingly less impressed with my own intelligence on an increasing scale. since that time. So.
How smug was she?
Well, she wrote. She's putting out a new book on writing, on story technique and so on. And she wrote me and asked me to write the foreword of her book. Can't not do that.
So on a scale of very to unbearable, we're quite toward the unbearable end.
She was pleased.
So Charles, is that the sort of thing that you do? You organise audiences?
Rogers Lasney used to say that every writer learns by writing 1 million words of crap. I was a slow learner, it took me 2 million words. Also, no two novels come out the same way. They're usually differences of technique in everything. I've done everything from write a 10,000 word outline for a 100,000 word book to just pants flying up the seat of my pants. And the only unifying characteristic I can describe is, according to my retired now editor, Ginger Ace, I get the best results when I'm enjoying myself. In general, if you read a novel where the author was just doing it with a time clock and groaning every day when they went to work, a bit of that lack of joy rubs off on the text. It's hard work. But one technique I do often use is to take two genres and bang them together hard and try and make sparks. And the Laundry Files was basically what happened when I tried to do, this was before The Office aired, but I was trying to do a comedy of bureaucratic technical support nightmares with added Lovecraftian horrors set in a rather seedy, run-down British government espionage agency straight out of Led Davies. And you know how well that worked. When I first sent it to my agent, she read it and she said, "No, Charlie, I've read this, which obviously I have, and I'm afraid I can't sell it, I'm not going to represent it, it's utterly uncommercial, nobody will buy it, it's far too cross-genre. Who the hell wants a comic horror, computer networking humour novel about spies and Lovecraftian monsters?"
What did you say to your agent? What did you say to your agent at that point? Did you say you're fired or try it anyway?
Well, she was successfully negotiating deals for other books, and once it did begin selling, she suddenly got religion.
Because you sent it to Golden Griffin or something?
No, Golden Griffin came second. It was first published as a serial in the short-lived Scottish science fiction magazine Spectrum SF, which some of you might have heard of. I don't know, about 1,000 copies. Then Golden Griffin got in touch with me and they wanted a novella for a series of chapters they were doing. At the time I was a bit busy, so I said, "Sorry guys, I can't write you a novella right now, but I've got this short novel." So they read it and say, "Charlie, do you want to publish your novel? There's just one problem, it's too short. We need some novella to go with it." So in due course, they sort of did this limited edition hardcover of the Atrocity Archives, an American small press. And then what really shook me was when the novella I wrote to go with it at the end of the book got shortlisted for Hugo, and then won. That wasn't in the manual.
Well, not in the script, anyway.
Yeah, it wasn't in the script.
So Mike, as someone who's written a lot into the comics, is this the same sort of thing that happens there?
Well, I guess in a way, the Felix Castor book was the easiest pitch I ever did because I was writing Hellblazer at the time. So I just showed Darren Ash at Little Brown some
that how
I've been
you...
reading my blog.
I haven't read your book. It was very interesting. It was very good. Is that how you sold your first book, your series?
I sold the Walker Papers by completely not listening to the rules. I have the elevator pitch. An elevator pitch is what you have if you step into an elevator at a convention and you discover that you are standing beside the high-powered editor of your dreams. And she says, "Oh, you're a writer? What do you write?" And your job is to have a succinct answer to that question that will cause her to invite you to walk down the hall with her after you get out of the elevator and you can tell her a little more about your book. And ideally, by the end of this conversation, you've made a sale. That's totally not what I did. The book that I sold, Urban Shaman, I sold by pitching it a proposal to Harlequin's Luna line, which is their new fantasy line, which was specifically looking for traditional swords and sorcery style fantasy with a strong female lead and a strong romantic subplot. So I sent them a contemporary urban fantasy novel with a strong female lead and virtually no romantic subplot, and they bought it immediately. That worked out well. And very shortly after that, I learned how to do elevator pitches, actually, because I was then in a position to actually be talking to editors. And I had a lot of things that I wanted to be able to sell. And they're kind of fun to do, an elevator pitch. My idea behind them is that you want to give them a character and a conflict and a question. And it doesn't have to be a question within the actual pitches. You want to raise a question in the editor's mind so that she will ask it. My elevator pitch for the Walker Papers is Seattle cop John Walker has no use for the supernatural, but the supernatural has quite a lot of use for her. When she is given a choice between dying or life as a shaman, she chooses to become a shaman and ends up fighting old gods in modern Seattle. And usually the reaction to this is, that's not much of a choice. I never said that was a good choice. We live under this perception that we have good choices and bad choices. Frequently we have a lot of crappy choices and have to do the best we can. And so I use those kinds of things to sell other books, having gotten the idea of it down from having written Urban Shaman and knowing how to boil that down. Yeah, I did a blog post about this the other day because a friend of mine was asking about it. So.
You were just saying that Felix Casper really only becomes Felix Casper in the second book of the series. Each of you, you've all done longish series, 5, 6, 7 books. I'm not sure. How many is Dresden Files up to?
I'm working on number 16.
So, how do you cope with the evolution of the character, the genre, the world outside, throughout the series? Charlie?
Well, steal from the best. And the best advice I've had on this is from Lois McMaster Bloodjoy, which is work out what the worst possible thing you can do to your protagonist is, then do it.
I think working in comics was a great sort of training ground for long-form storytelling in other media. Because in comics, you've got a little tiny installment coming out every month, and within that, you've got to step up a bit for this storyline, but seed some stuff for the next storyline, and seed some other stuff for a long, long way, or maybe a couple of years ahead. It's like a soap opera. It's very like a soap opera.
And you can't kill them off.
Well, you can, but they come back. In comics, death is like a head cold. You get over it. I think I wrote the cast of it largely as though I was writing a monthly book, a monthly comic book. And the other thing I did was I stole bits from my own life because both John Constantine and Felix Casper were Scousers living in London, and I was a Scouser living in London, so I could just mine my own paths, but make it exciting.
I went into the Walker Papers with actually, I also learned from the best, in which case was Jim. I've known Jim for a very long time. I remember when he was writing the first of the Dresden Files as a, well, maybe show my teacher. And he had, even then, this plan, Dresden Files. And so when I went into writing the Walker Papers, I went in with a plan. And I had 3 specific character arcs that I wanted to pursue. And the series was supposed to be 9 books long. It ended up with 11 stories. But and that's what I did, was I developed a character. She had certain challenges of certain sizes. The first 3 were a big, huge blow up. They were real, true, huge monsters. The second 3 folded down again. They were smaller, more human challenges, and that reflected her personal growth as well. And then there's the final 3 books, which build back up to the big bad. And so I had a very clear plan on what I was going to do with the series and how it was going to be shaped. And at the last book, Shaman Rises, just came out last year, and I'm actually really happy with how the story arc developed. I feel like I did the right thing by the character and the world and the size of the stories that I did over the course of the books. So that's how I pursued it.
So Jim, you had an arc that's 16 books long? What did your writing professor think of this?
Okay, I turned in the first couple of chapters of the first Dresden book, and she looked back at me, and this was a teacher who pulled no punches when it came to critiquing things for kids, because she didn't believe in not getting you ready for the real world. So, I mean, she would have critique for me, everything up to what you were thinking, to actually rolling up my chapter and leaning across the desk and popping me in the head with it and asking what I was thinking. And I'd gotten plenty of criticism from her before, and she read the first couple of chapters of the Dresden Files and said, "You did it." And I said, "I did what?" Because I thought it was an accusation. And she said, "No, you've done it. This will sell. I don't know if this will be the first thing you sell, but this is of professional quality, it's of saleable quality, and you'll be able to sell this someday." And my jaw just hit the floor as she said this. And I said, "Okay." And she says, "All right, so now you need to plan the rest of it." And she meant the rest of the novel. But I came back, it was a survey, and I came back the next week, for the conference, and very excited, and explaining to her the entire rest of how I envision this playing out. And I'm thinking it could be like about a 20-book long series, and then like a big old apocalyptic trilogy at the end, because who doesn't love apocalyptic trilogies? And I was just burbling with excitement, and to this day I can see the expression on her face. And she was trying not to laugh at it, because she had finally gotten me on board, and she didn't want to kill my newborn enthusiasm, but she didn't want to put her hand on my shoulder and tell me, "Jim, you're never going to be able to sell a 20-book series to an editor either." So I'm like, and then big apocalyptic trilogy, what do you think? And I just remember the look on her face is just deadpan. She looks across the desk at me and says, "I think if you sell a 20-book series, that should be fine." Should be doing all right. And then because I did not know how impossible it was going to be, I did it. But yeah, like I said, I've become steadily less impressed with my own intelligence as I've gotten older. So.
And have you kept to that original one?
At this point, I'm getting a little superstitious about it. I mean, it's so not broken, I want to not fix it. So, yeah, I still have my original outline in a notebook at home, and I go back and consult it, and we're still more or less on track. My son's not going to decided not to go to grad school, so I'm not going to be, extending the series or anything. But although I am teaching him writing craft now, so he'll show me up in that too, like he did with sword fighting.
But I mean, back to my original point was that the world changes over, and know. Yes, I mean, it's been years since you wrote the first book.
Yes.
There have been crazes for vampires, crazes for zombies, crazes for, I don't know, werewolves.
Yeah, and it got to where it was getting hard to keep track of that around book 9 or 10, and I'm on book 16 now. So, but the big advantage that I have is that the fans did a Wikipedia, and
I'm so jealous of how Wikipedia.
I will go look things up on the fan Wikipedia. You guys track it so much more closely than I possibly could. By the time you write a book, you write your first draft and you go through and clean it up, and maybe you go through and clean it up again, and then I have beta readers who read it, and I have to fix things up, according to what the beta reader said, and then the editor comes back with comments, and there's some changes, and then there's the copy editor that comes back with changes, and by the time you're finished a book, you've seen 11 or 12 slightly different variations of the same book, and by the time, and keeping one or two of those straight, sure, no problem. By the time you get up to 16, that's 170 something. I don't know. I can't do math right now. I haven't slept for about 30 hours, so I'm a little punchy. But by the time you've got that many copies, you can't keep track of all of them in your head. There's just no way to do it. And worse, you've just kind of got this cloud of possibilities, how things could have happened in the story and didn't, or that you did change and didn't, or that you considered doing and decided not to do. And it's hard to remember which one did I actually put down as the actual parallel reality that happened in this story.
Jim, can I give you a cautionary tale about relying on the fan wiki vote? Because I got one of those too, as I discovered a while back. But I sold the role-playing game rights, and there's a laundry role-playing game, and it's a very good role-playing game, and I wish you'd all go out and buy it because I'll eventually get royalties. But they've designed some role-playing game supplements, and the game company runs these past me for a nod and a wink, but sometimes when I'm a bit too busy, I don't have time to check it. So I was looking in the wiki for background stuff, and what the hell is this? I don't remember writing that. Oh my god, I haven't written that.
That's awesome. The great part is that you had to go, wait, did I write this?
You have a role-playing game as well. What have they been doing without telling you?
They've actually been pretty good about it. I mean, there have been the guys in the role-playing game have been kind of fanatical. And in fact, they started coming to me with these things from the series that made me feel good, because it was like, well, if this is true, and this is true, and this is true, then this must also be true. And so we wouldn't put this in the game. And I'm like, yeah, but you can't, because that's going to be in book 19. Ruin it for me, guys. Ruin it.
I've got that problem as well.
But still, it makes
Your lives are so hard.
It makes you feel good that you've done so much work building this world that other people have gone, oh, wait a minute, I see how this works now. And they can figure it out too. And I'm a nerd, guys. I've worked really hard on that.
So, Charlie, you have beta readers. I know because
Yeah.
I'm on your live journal.
Right.
Do you find the same problems that Jim has, that you're losing track of versions?
Well, yeah, I should also add I have really serious hypertension that's controlled by medicine, some of which actually holds in my memory at times. I'm pretty much on top of it at present, and I know how to argue over side effects with doctors, but there are these big patches of my life where I can't remember what was going on much. This includes writing some books. So also, by the time you've written a book, you've read it several times, and I go word blind on it very easily. I'm much happier doing the creative stuff with a clear blue field ahead of me than I am redrafting or editing. In fact, there's quite a lot of my books I have never read since they were published. I'm leaving them on the shelf for a decade before I can actually go back. You write the books you'd like to read and nobody's writing, and then you can't bear to read them. By the
time you get done with it, it's like, please, get this
in revision, I fixed something that then later I've essentially forgotten that I fixed it. So I can actually really surprise myself reading my own books, which is somewhat embarrassing. But that happened with, there's one scene in Urban Shaman that, although I have learned mostly to anticipate it, it's still, when I get to it, it shocks me. Someone dies, and I'm never prepared for it. But I had this vision of what was going to happen with the character if that character did not die, and there's apparently some alternate world in which that's where the story went. And so when I get to that bit of the story, I'm always like, oh, how did I do that? Similarly, in the last book, in Shaman Rises, in my initial draft, I screwed up. I made a mistake. And when I went back and fixed it, the story that I remember was the one I messed up. So when the book came back to me in copy edits, which was like the third stage of revision at that point, besides what you've done yourself, I got to the bit where it changed, and I was like, that's really good! Because it took me completely by surprise. I was totally unprepared for it. And I hope that was a good sign. It meant that readers would also be totally unprepared for it.
Sign how well we don't deal with reality.
But this happens to writers have to be like this all the time. Where people like, no, I can't look at this book anymore that I have written because I've gone through it 1,000 times, and then you don't know, you don't remember anymore which version is the one that ended up in the hands of the readers.
Well, continuity was a colossal problem for me, not when I was writing Hellblazer. There's only 300 issues of Hellblazer, and I read them. When I was writing the X-Men, I mean, there are something like 6,000 issues of stories with X-Men characters in them. If you take any two X-Men characters at random, they will have been lovers, one of them will have killed the other, and one of them will be the son or daughter of the other. The timeline. So I made extensive use of a site called UncannyXmen.net, which is this colossal online database with synopses of every issue and spotlights on specific characters, character biographies. And if I got really stuck, I would write to the moderators and say, look, did this ever happen? Or when did both of the speak first appear on the same page at the same time? And they were really happy to help me. Until I wrote a story where Rogue and Magneto became lovers, and then they just said, you're dead to it.
Yeah, that's the advantage of the fan resource, is that the fans they've seen the canon, they've seen only the one true version of the story that you've actually published, and they don't have that cloud of stories in their heads to use them. Guys, I love that Wikipedia. How many kids did the Carpenters have? I can't remember.
What color were that character's eyes? I don't know.
Exactly. Let me go look it up here.
Yeah, I have 17 books that I have to go through to find out the color of that character's eyes. Or I can go to Wikipedia. Thank God.
Hey, there it is.
So there's a number of tropes that keep turning up in urban fantasy, just to, drag this kind of back to what the original about. And so it's very much about Western mythology in an urban environment. Do you see cross-cultural? Do you see Jin?
Oh, hell yeah, there's a lot of it out there.
Chinese vampires turning up in urban fantasy?
Let me give you some examples. Liz Williams has an excellent series, the Detective Inspector Chen series, which are set in a Chinese city in a somewhat magical world where, among other things, the classic Chinese heaven and hell are real bureaucracies. Detective Inspector Chen has a passport that entitles him to visit hell to interrogate the souls of murdered people. There is Malaysian fantasy writer Zen Cho, who I think is going to be here tomorrow maybe, who has a short story collection called Spirits Abroad with a lot of Malaysian influence experienced urban fantasy, and her first novel comes out later this year. Racking off the top of my head, I'm not an expert in this field, but it is out there. There's quite a lot of it.
Well, I'm interested in that, I think. One of the brilliant things that Gaiman's imaginative universe is he creates a stage where it makes sense for Judeo-Christian angels to be talking to Chinese storm gods, and you don't blink. It's because he creates a mythology that subsumes all existing mythology. I kind of tried to do the same thing when I was writing Hellblazer. I had a story where John recruits an Aztec god, Nick Tank took a leap to help a demon.
The Walker Papers, the main character is part Irish and part Cherokee Indian. And so, although it's a Western culture, I drew a lot on Cherokee legend for those books, which was great fun. It was great fun doing the research and finding monsters. I always liked Native American mythology, so I had it sort of in the back of my mind all the time. But when I started writing these, I started really looking into mythologies that we don't get as a matter of course. And using those was great fun. I also, in my Old Races trilogy, I drew on the Jinn, and my dragons are very Chinese. And I don't know nearly enough non-Western urban fantasy. And one of the great things about being done with the Walker Papers series is that for a long, long time, reading urban fantasy was like work. I would open up an urban fantasy novel, and I would either be wishing I had written that book, I would be thinking how I would have done that differently if it were mine, or I would be picking it apart on a sentence level. I wouldn't have done it like that. So it was not escape reading at all, because I was writing so much of it. It was reading, it became very much just another part of work. But I'm finished with those series right now, and I have this vast library of urban fantasy that I'm finally starting to catch up on. And I would really like to get into more of the non-Western stuff, just because the mythologies and the stories that we don't know are generally terrific, and I love to see what people do with them. And Charlie is right, Liz Williams' books are brilliant. They're fantastic stories.
Neat.
When I was writing the Dresden Files, one of the things that I wanted to be sure to do as I was building the mythology of the story universe was I wanted to, whenever I approached it, I never wanted to say why something couldn't be happening. It was always why this would fit into mythology. I wanted it to be an inclusive mythology where I could have, I could make up my own original stuff. I could original as much as I can manage to be. Every time I've come up with something new and awesome, I realize that I've stolen it from somewhere, and I just didn't remember stealing it. You know, Bob the Skull, I thought he was a great character, and I came up with that all by myself. It was kind of an in-joke between me and my writing professor, and then I watched the opening segment of Scooby-Doo. Right there at the beginning, I'm like, oh man, I suck. But the idea was that I wanted to build a story where I could always include something new that I found, or something new that I enjoyed or loved, rather than working out, rather than having to constantly confront, well, how could I possibly actually have Odin fit into the same universe with Mab? How could I have, et cetera, et cetera. The idea was that, no, of course all those things fit together. All I have to do is figure out their particular relationship and how have they messed up each other's life before. And that made for, there were so many more story possibilities with that. And that's also probably the reason why there's this huge cloud of things that I didn't write in my head. I should write I could have done story at some point.
So Charlie, unconscious influences. Scooby-Doo?
Now you've seen through my plan. If it wasn't for you meddling kids, right? I'd be so tempted to see that.
I was very taken by your Cult Comfort Farm ripoff.
Yeah, that's more of a specific. A big thread for the Laundry Files has been actually explicit pastiches of particular authors. The first 4 novels were, because it's a secret government agency for protecting us from Lovecraftian horrors, the first first novel, The Atrocity Archives, was the Len Dayton novel. The next novel, The Jennifer book, was the Ian Fleming Broccoli franchise Bond movie. The third book, The Fuller Memorandum, it was going to be an Adam Paul thriller, but I got bored of Adam Paul and decided to go on an Anthony Price reading binge. It's an Anthony Price spy thriller. Lots of scholarly digging around in archives, followed by some horrible, evil, sordid violence at the end. The fourth book was the Peter O'Donnell Modesty Blaze novel. Modesty Blaze versus a televangelist with a book of summoning. Then I got bored with doing that because I get bored really easily, and I did the research chart. And, oh hell, elevator pitches. Do you know what? I sold the research chart on a one-sentence elevator pitch. I went into a meeting with my editor to explain why the novel I was working on needed a 1-year extension. But there's this laundry novel that really wants to be written. Oh, tell me about it, she said. Oh, I'll just give you the first sentence. Don't be silly, Bob, said Mo. Everybody knows vampires don't exist. So, on that basis, I just got a stony stare, followed by, tell your agent to send me a memo. I'm iterating through the various different urban fantasy subgenres. The vampire one was followed by Echo the Unicorn novella, with Cold Comfort Farm and H.P. Lovecraft's sexual dysfunction. The new novel that comes out in July is the superhero novel. And I'm currently working on The Elven Invasion of West Yorkshire.
So your influence aren't so much subtle or unconscious.
They are, however, warped and twisted, try and reinvent things. And yeah, there is a point in the research chart at which a vampire sparkles. When he's been shot with a basilisk gun, which does pretty much what you'd expect.
So, Mike, warped and twisted influences?
Well, Raven Candle by way of Rogers Lasney, but in another way, Ursula Le Guin. Not in any obvious respect, but I love how all of her books, when she uses magic, she makes it work by rules, and she tells you what the rules are, and she makes the rules be springboards to the story. I kind of hate reading the kind of urban fantasy where you have vampires and werewolves and ghosts and demons and fairies and whatnot else, and they all come from their own separate worlds, and they all have their own separate rationales and their own separate sets of rules. And it's kind of like, milk and vinegar. The Castor books have ghosts, they have werewolves, they have demons, and they have zombies. No vampires. There's a lunatic who thinks he's a vampire, but he's not. But it's the same mechanism. It's just one mechanism, one rule. If you die, you can come back as a ghost. If you're scared of being a ghost, you can climb back into your own corpse, and that's what zombies are. They're just ghosts animating their own dead flesh, because they're used to it. If your own body's not available, you can steal an animal body and kind of redecorate it. Make it look more like you remember yourself looking like. That's what werewolves are. And demons are kind of metastasized, poisonous to themselves. It's all worked by rule. Yeah, the rules are set in.
Well, like I said, with the Walker Papers, I was deliberately trying to marry Native American mythologies and Irish mythologies. And actually turned out worked pretty well on a lot of levels. There are a lot of Joanne, my main character, learned Native American terms, but it turns out that in shamanism worldwide, there are so many similarities. It was fascinating reading. It was so interesting reading, learning to write those books. There are so many similarities worldwide that you can look into almost any culture's shamanistic practices, and you find that they have the same levels of reality. They have different names for them. So that was how I went into it. Those were the direct influences there. And the other thing that particularly influenced me is more something that I think that I react against. Which is when I was a kid, all of the books all the fantasy that I read and loved it, that I really remember sticking with me, Narnia, the Lloyd Alexander books, the Darkest Rising books, all of these books Lord of the Rings, although I never actually got through those ones. They're wonderful stories, but they're stories in which the magic goes away. And after a while, I realized that I was writing stories in which the magic comes back. I think that's very much, I didn't realize it for a long time, but that was definitely an unconscious influence in terms of I was reacting against that. So that's what I do, is I write stories where the magic comes back.
Influences. Big Trouble in Little China. Yeah, I really, Tremors is a big influence. All kinds of, I love watching bad old movies, and bad old movies are almost always on in the background when I'm working. Movies that I've seen so often that they're really more music than they are movie at this point, because I know how they go. Or movies that are so bad that they're not going to distract me from working, except to occasionally look up at a particularly bad or particularly good part that's just occasionally in there. When I'm writing, the Dresden Files especially, I'm often thinking of a particular inspiration for it. Skin Game was the Ocean's 11 episode of the Dresden Files. Deadbeat was the White Wolf episode of the Dresden Files. We're going to go ahead and do some Warhammer on this week on the Dresden Files, Warhammer. And that's kind of the way I think. I suspect Buffy was really a huge influence, although a much huger influence was probably Babylon 5. Thank you. Yes. I just got done rewatching it and just appreciating all the foreshadowing stuff that got dropped in, and loved it. But that was a show that told a lot of storylines and had a lot of characters, and there was always questions about who was a good guy and who was a bad guy. There were always issues that you had to worry about. They asked some really strong questions during the course of that show, and most importantly, they Straczynski planted seeds early in the show that didn't come out until much, much, much later. Some of them not until the very, very end. That show the kind of patience of storytelling that you don't really get to see on television very often anymore, because you've got to get something done right away this season or it gets canceled. And with the Dresden Files, I wanted things that you read in the first book to mean more when you got to them later. When you looked back on them later in the series, and to write the series not just to be read, but to be reread. And that was something that I got from Straczynski that I thought was one of the most enjoyable things about B5. It was enjoyable to rewatch. So my influence is television. Too much TV. Really the problem.
Well, we're down to the last 5 minutes. Charlie, anything you want to wind up on?
Yeah. There's one thought that's been wanting to getting very meta about the general subject of urban fantasy in general. We're living in a really complex century, and I've noticed there's not that much extravagant near future science fiction going on, but a lot of urban fantasy. And it occurs to me, we live in a world which is functionally perfused by magic. We're all carrying around these magic mirrors that give us access to the sum total of human knowledge in our pockets, although we mostly use them for taking selfies and watching cat videos. The devices around us all run on magic smoke. You let the magic smoke out and they stop working. We have rituals we perform to make the gadgets around us do things. And there are these strange shadowy entities that have malign influence on our lives. We call them corporations, you might as well call them artificial intelligences or gods. But we're surrounded by these strange numerous influences. And it seems to me that in some ways, urban fantasy is a more useful vehicle than extrapolative science fiction for exploring how we live in a world we're not entirely in control of and don't fully understand.
Particularly given that, and I know this is your personal experience, that if you were trying to actually write near-future science fiction, the present tends to catch up and overtake you. So you have an idea and you'll think, oh, great, this is something that I can set in the book, it's gonna happen in 5 years. And there's a news article about how it's happened today. And so actually giving it that veneer of magic,
Yeah.
I think that's great.
I just want to plug Francis Harding's Cuckoo song again. This is an unsolicited testimony.
Jim?
Oh, I'm really tired. I think we could come up with something a little bit better than that to close on, but not tonight.
I think we should let Jim go to bed. Thank you very much. The panel, Charles Stross, Mike Carey, C.E. Murphy, Jim Butcher, and thank you, the audience.